the trial of Karen Reed for the death of her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, is underway.
There are 17 jurors, and they're coming and going with a police escort.
I've seen a lot of things. I've never seen anything like this. This case never ceases to amaze me.
The first week of testimony has come to an end.
It's a spectacle, that's for sure.
We really heard the defense highlight some of the discrepancies between what was documented and what first responders said they remembered.
There are a lot of issues in this case.
Proctor was improperly searching Karen Reed's cell phone for nude photos.
The fact that the investigation wasn't thorough provides a big wrinkle in the prosecution's case.
They're supposed to be creating this reasonable doubt, and they're doing exactly that.
Everybody wants to know, us included, why he wouldn't go inside that home on the night that the body was discovered.
There are more people here at the beginning of this than at the beginning of Johnny Depp's trial.
It's always the theories or stories that each side will put forth, right, for a jury to listen to and decide which one is more believable.
We asked Karen Reed about that alleged confession. Karen, did you ever say I hit him?
I did not.
The FBI is investigating an investigation of a murder. That never, ever happens.
Karen Reed was drunk and angry and hit and killed John O'Keefe when she gunned it in the snowstorm.
We're looking at arm injuries with scratches. We're not looking at tire tracks.
I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head.
Defense attorneys learn in school, first class, the most important thing you can do is identify and select stupid juries.
We're not concerned about any of the witnesses. None of the Commonwealth's witnesses are concerning us.
Karen Reed is facing up to life in prison.
I just hope justice is served for either one, whatever it is, you know.
The fate of her life is not in her hands anymore. It's not in the hands of her attorneys. It's not in the hands of the prosecutor. It's in the hands of the jury now.
Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed! Free Karen Reed!
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment I think we have all been waiting for, the crash Reconstructionists. This is the testimony that we sat through 9 weeks waiting to hear. This is the testimony that we've been needing for more than 2 years. Someone to explain to us how those injuries can come from that car without there being some kind of damage that we would all expect to see in any other incident involving a car going 24 miles an hour. Make it make sense. Trooper Joe Paul of the Massachusetts State Police is currently assigned to CARS, or Collision Analysis and Reconstruction Section. Now, Trooper Paul was on the stand on days 25 and 26, and there was a lot of technical testimony, and we are going to dissect it, but what's important right now is his final conclusion. I played this in the last episode so we could compare the expert testimony to it, but as a refresher, here is what Trooper Paul says happened.
So, throughout my investigation, this appeared to be a single car collision involving a pedestrian. The vehicle was traveling at a higher acceleration when. Sorry. The vehicle accelerated at a high rate of speed before she struck the pedestrian John O'Keefe on the roadway and subsequently left him at the scene. So this collision occurred on Saturday, January 29, 2022 at approximately 12:45 hours. A 2021 Lexus LX 570 was traveling southbound on Fairview Road, in Area 34 Fairview Road. The operator appeared to be Karen Reed, and the pedestrian was John O'Keefe. The vehicle traveled up to 24 miles per hour and approximately 62 feet. The right rear of the Lexus struck the pedestrian John O'Keefe. Mr. O'Keefe was projected forward and to the left along the front yard of 34 Fairview Road. The Lexus continued traveling in reverse before they left the area.
So before we get started, this entire episode will feature mostly 3 witnesses' testimony. The first is Trooper Joe Paul from Massachusetts State Police. The second is Dr. Michael Wolf from ARCCA. And the third is Dr. Andrew Rentschler from ARCCA. Now, first, a little bit about Trooper Paul's relevant training, education, and experience. He took 3 classes, before he could join the department. Each class was 40 hours long. So basically, he had 3 weeks of classes. Now, the first was basic scene crash investigation. The next was advanced crash investigation. And the third was traffic crash reconstruction. Each of those, 40 hours. Since joining the department, he's done some more training on anything from bicycle crash investigation to human factors. So that's his training. Now, his experience, he said, he's been to approximately 196 crashes, and probably 55 of those were pedestrian involved. Now, let's look at the two experts from ARCCA, which is a forensic engineering consultant firm. Side note, both Dr. Wolf and Dr. Rentschler were brought into this because of the federal investigation that has been opened to look into this case and investigation. Now, the prosecution did not hire them. The defense did not hire them. The Department of Justice hired them. That is important because they don't have a rehomed dog in this fight. And ARCCA is a big deal. They work with the federal government. They work with the National Hockey League on player safety. They work with the U.S. Department of Defense, where they basically designed energy-absorbing seats for the military to help protect soldiers when they drive over IEDs. They're a big deal. Now, if you follow this case on my YouTube or on social media, you may hear the two ARCCA experts affectionately referred to as the Crash Daddies. That's because these are the two dudes who can give the most insight into what may or may not have happened. Their experience, their education, everything about them is really impressive, and their knowledge is, well, you'll see. First up, Dr. Michael Wolf, the Director of Accident Reconstruction at ARCCA. Dr. Wolf has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from James Madison University, along with a minor in mathematics. He studied physics, statics, dynamics, kinematics, material science, along with other engineering sciences. He then went on to the University of Delaware to pursue his PhD in electrical and computer engineering with a concentration in electromagnetics and photonics. In addition to that, he has continued to take courses through Northwestern University in crash reconstruction. He is trained in photogrammetry, which is the science of extracting information out of pictures. So things dimensionally about an object spatially without ever actually physically seeing the object or inspecting it. Just doing it all through pictures. Now, Trooper Paul knew that he had worked 196 crashes. Very specific, 196. But Dr. Wolf said that he doesn't track that kind of thing. He does know that it's well over 1,000, though. He has authored peer-reviewed papers in the field of physics, including a number of papers in the field of lighting and optics, and, ironically enough, a recent publication that deals with Toyota and Lexus vehicle control history records, including triggers in a Lexus and how the information is recorded. He has published peer-reviewed articles on this, and you'll know more about why this is important later. So Dr. Wolf worked with Dr. Rentschler, and his main focus was the damage to the car. Dr. Rentschler's main focus was the damage to John O'Keefe and the injuries. Dr. Andrew Rentschler is a biomechanical engineer and accident reconstructionist. He's actually the vice president and the director of biomechanics for the Midwest Division at ARCCA. Now, he has his Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering with a minor in Biomedical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. He went on to get his Master's in Bioengineering and Biomechanical Engineering from the University of Pittsburgh, and then he got his doctorate or PhD in Bioengineering and Biomechanics, also from University of Pittsburgh. He specialized in research and analysis to evaluate specifically the study of the relationship between crash injuries to humans, this is what we need to know, and crash forces. He continues his education by attending seminars and professional classes with respect to biomechanics as well as accident reconstruction, and looking at new technology and research within the field in respect to injuries. So his specialty, his main focus in terms of his engineering degree and education is literally an accident reconstructionist and how the accident and injuries are related. So the biomechanics is going to be really important here. If you'll remember, Dr. Scorti-Bello said on the stand, she's the medical examiner for the prosecution that testified. She said that she could not testify to the injuries being caused by the SUV because she is not an expert in biomechanics or crash reconstruction. This guy is, so he's going to be the one who can answer the questions that Dr. Scorti-Bello couldn't. Biomechanics is really just looking at the injuries to the human body. So they use traditional engineering principles and apply it to the body because an injury is just an engineering problem, he says. Instead of looking at a piece of steel that if you know the dimensions and the size and you apply a force, it'll bend and break. Instead of that, he says they look at the human body. How much force does it take, and how does the force have to be applied to get a humerus fracture or a vertebrae disc injury or any type of injury that's specific. So all of the mechanisms that you need to produce those injuries, that's what he looks at as a biomechanical engineer. That means that he's going to be the one who can tell us, are those injuries from John O'Keefe's body possible from being struck by a car? So that gives you an idea of the comparisons that we are going to be making with the crash reconstructionists. Now, keep in mind, the ARCCA experts are part of the federal investigation. So the defense or the Commonwealth were not able to just jump on over and talk about their testing and their results. They did get access to the summary report, so they know the basics of what they're going to say, but neither the prosecution nor the defense has been able to discuss anything further with them. So during the voir dire, Dr. Michael Wolf was up first, and Attorney Alan Jackson questioned him as he gave his long list of experience and credentials and training and education, etc., 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 and a basic description of what he was focused on when he was doing the testing. He says that they were basically given an open-ended question. Was the evidence consistent with a pedestrian accident between John O'Keefe and the Lexus SUV? He said that they formed their opinions based on the evidence that was provided to them by the FBI and the Department of Justice. So Lally gets up to question him. Now, it seems like Lally is implying by his questioning that the information that was provided to the ARCCA experts was not enough for them to come to a conclusion. I think what it is that he doesn't have the conclusion that he wants. So he's looking for ways for these experts with all of their training and all of their experience and all of their knowledge and all of their testing. He's looking for a way to discredit that. Now, he asks some weird questions about if he looked at all of the documents himself or if it was done as a team. Weird question, but Dr. Wolf confirms he did. He also gets a little snarky and refers to them both as Mr. instead of Doctor a couple times. But he asked Dr. Wolf, are you being asked if the injuries are consistent with the SUV specifically related to the head injury? In other words, he's asking, are you going to give the opinion that the head injury is what is not consistent with John O'Keefe being struck by an SUV? Let me tell you why this is important. First, let's go back in time a little bit. This is from March 12th of this year. At a pretrial hearing, Attorney Alan Jackson gets up and addresses the judge about this exact report.
The federal investigators hired, independent of us, we had no idea, and independent of the Commonwealth, hired a professional reconstructionist, 3 PhDs, to look into exactly this issue. Did Karen Reed's car, did her SUV make contact with John O'Keefe? And their conclusion to a person was his injuries were inconsistent with the damage on the car. The damage on the car was inconsistent, having made contact with John O'Keefe's body. In other words, the car didn't hit him, and he wasn't hit by the car. Period, full stop. That's their independent expert, not ours. Not somebody on our payroll, like Mr. Whiffen, or one of their experts, or Trooper Guarino, who's an arm of the agency. This is an independent federal government witness or series of witnesses who say unequivocally, that car did not hit John O'Keefe, and John O'Keefe was not hit by that car.
So in March of this year, Attorney Alan Jackson says the federal report specifically says that the car did not hit John O'Keefe, and John O'Keefe was not hit by the car. When I heard this, I thought, this is huge. This is a big deal. How could this possibly go to trial if that's the conclusion? But, of course, it went to trial anyway. The following month, right before trial started, there was a hearing held for motions in limine, and Lally addressed this report. Here is Adam Lally.
The counsel references the federal grand jury materials in which I would say, as has been done numerous times previously, is severely mischaracterized as to what they actually contain. And it's not a crash reconstructionist as it's been alleged here before, it's a biomechanical engineer. And essentially what they did was take painstaking lengths to go to determine that the defendant's vehicle did not strike Mr. O'Keefe in the back of the head, which is simply something that no one has ever said, intimated at any point ever.
So Lally said that Jackson is misrepresenting the report. Now, I want to break this down into two things. First, the reason that he's asking the Reconstructionists during voir dire about specifically looking for the head injury as it relates to being hit by the car is because he said in that pretrial hearing that the ARCCA experts went through all of this testing painstakingly just to get to the conclusion about the head injury not being caused by impact from the car. And he says that wasn't part of the theory anyway. But the Reconstructionists tell him that they were not told to specifically look at just the head injury. It was an open-ended question about the injuries in general. So is this entire report only going to tell us that the head injuries weren't caused by being hit by Karen's car? We'll get to that later in this episode. The other part of this that I wanted to mention is what Lally said about there being no accident reconstructionists, only biomechanical engineers. Now we know that was unequivocally false. We just went over their education and training and qualifications, and that we just went over isn't even all of it. Dr. Wolf is literally the director of the accident reconstructionists at ARCCA. And Dr. Rentschler is a biomechanical engineer, yes, but he is also an accident reconstructionist. Jackson was not the one misrepresenting this report. Lally was. That was a big accusation against Jackson, and it was him who was misrepresenting it. Just like in the last episode, when Lally accused David Yannetti in a public document of saying something that was false. Once again, Lally has either intentionally misrepresented something or didn't read the report. And honestly, I don't really know which one is worse. Dr. Wolf finishes up and Dr. Rentschler is brought in for his questioning during voir dire. Now remember, the whole point of this is because these attorneys have not yet been able to talk to the experts, and the judge needs to hear the qualifications so that she can decide what these guys are going to be allowed to testify about. Jackson walks through the questioning with Dr. Rentschler, and he goes over all of his extensive experience, education, and training. He also breaks down the different sciences that are used to come to his conclusions, and he's incredibly clear and really easy to understand. He's giving all of this information, and I'm literally thinking the jury will love him because he's so great at explaining these complicated things in a very uncomplicated way, and he's not boring. Then we hear that he's testified as an expert in hundreds of trials, and I am not surprised. He's impressive. So Lally gets up to question him, and he confirms that the findings were given to the attorneys, but the experts were told not to discuss the reports with anyone other than who they were hired by. Now, he questions again about the findings being based on the limited information that he was given by the FBI and Department of Justice. This is going to be something that is consistently brought up by Lally. He says that the information that was given to them was limited. So he thinks that because they didn't have all of the information from the case, their findings aren't as valid. Then Lally asked Dr. Rentschler the same question about if they were asked to specifically look at the injuries on the back of John O'Keefe's head and determine if that was caused by contact with the car. Dr. Rentschler says it is one of the questions that he was asked. Lally says no further questions. Look, that's all he wanted the court to hear, just that the head part, just that part, just that the head injury, he says isn't relevant anyway, didn't come from the car. So I give props to Judge Canoni here because she wasn't going to let it go at that. She wanted more info, and she asked Dr. Rentschler specifically what he was asked to do.
Regarding the specific request, what were you tasked to do specifically?
So specifically overall, I was tasked from the biomechanical standpoint to determine or see if it's possible to determine how the injuries in this case occurred. And part of that was determine whether the injuries, the head injury and the arm injuries resulted from contact with the Lexus in this case.
The judge also asked Dr. Rentschler about any cases that he has testified to in Massachusetts. And he tells her a couple of them so that she can look them up. She has a packet of papers that the defense gave her about all of the cases that he's worked on and things that he's done. So this is presumably because laws are different in different states. And there are about 12 or 13 states that have the law stating that the biomechanical engineers are not able to testify to medical causations of an injury. So I'm assuming that's why she's asking. Now, after hearing from both of the ARCCA experts, the judge then hears arguments from the prosecution and the defense on what should and should not be allowed in their testimony. The report apparently has 4 specific conclusions. So Jackson wants the experts to testify to all 4, but Lally wants the 4th one excluded. This one, the 4th one, reads as follows. There is currently insufficient evidence to determine the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's skull or brain injuries or the circumstances surrounding the event. Now, Lally says that he doesn't think that either of them are qualified to testify to this because it would be more of an area of forensic pathology. I gotta be honest, Lally saying these experts are not qualified to give their opinions on what could have caused the skull or brain injuries is wild, considering he had Trooper Buchanan and Trooper Paul on the stand giving their opinions on these head injuries and what could have caused them. That's wild to me. Regardless, Jackson points out to the judge that Lally is going to have Trooper Paul give his opinion on the head injury, saying that he believes that it was caused by the curb or because the road is blunt, and it is a blunt force injury. So these guys are going to get up there and say that there is insufficient evidence to support that determination. In the end, the judge does say that the biomechanical engineer is unable to testify to medical causation of an injury. She told Jackson during the voir dire that if he had objected to the testimony about the medical causation from the troopers, that she would have left that out. Something seems really off about this because if the jury is able to hear testimony from people who are definitely not qualified to give it, but then they aren't allowed to hear testimony from somebody who is allowed to give it, at least in 38 other states, it feels just off to me. It's like allowing the jury to get bad information, but then not allowing somebody who's qualified to tell them that it's bad information. But that's the way the law works, I guess. So now that we know what's allowed in and what's not, who's testifying, and how qualified they are, it's now time to walk through the theory and the testing and compare it all to each other. Right after this. Trooper Joe Paul got involved in this investigation when he was originally asked to do 3 main things. 1, inspect and test Karen's SUV. 2, image the ACM or airbag control module. And 3, map the scene out. So let's walk through each of these. Let's work our way through his 3 jobs in the order that he did them. First up was the visual inspection and the testing of Karen Reed's SUV. On February 1st of 2022, Trooper Paul went to the Canton Police Department Sallyport to first inspect the car and record any damage so that he could use that in his reconstruction efforts. And then he wanted to do some performance testing on it. Now, the visual inspection is basically just to make note of any of the damage in order to help him determine what may or may not have happened to the victim based on what's messed up or not messed up on the car. Pictures are shown to the jury as he walks us through the scratches and a small dent on the back. But the damage is so minimal that other than the taillight, it's really kind of hard to see in these pictures. Paul says that there were scratches on the bottom right rear of the car and scratches and a dent on the rear of the car and glass from what he said was a cup on the bumper. Now, the cup part was stricken from the record. He measured the distance of the dents, and he said that they were 48 to 50 inches from the ground and approximately 19 inches from the right side of the vehicle. Now, obviously, we know that the damage was concentrated on the back passenger side, and after Trooper Paul points it out and the jury sees the pictures, Lally asked to show the video of Karen Reed backing out of John O'Keefe's garage and striking his car in the driveway. The defense objects and asks to approach, and shortly after that, the judge sends the jury home. So let me break down what was about to happen. Lally was planning on asking Trooper Paul to give expert opinion on why he thinks that the damage on Karen Reed's car could not have come from the impact in the driveway at John O'Keefe's house. The problem with this is that any expert opinion that's given in trial has to be given to opposing counsel beforehand. This is the whole reason that they had to do the voir dire of the crash reconstructionists and the medical examiners. So the jury is sent home, and the judge decides to do a voir dire of Trooper Paul to hear what his opinion is on this and why Lally thinks that he's qualified to give it. Then the judge can decide if this will be let in for the jury to hear or not. So Lally starts by asking about how much force would be necessary in order to cause Karen's taillight to crack by hitting John O'Keefe's car. The judge says that he needs to lay foundation, and he says that he's been to 196 crashes, and then Lally starts asking about his training in physics and the damage between cars on impact.
What, if any, training or knowledge do you have in regard to physical forces of vehicles in a collision sequence, and what kind of damage you would anticipate?
So obviously the higher the speed, the more damage. The lower speed, the less damage.
So, to be clear, Lally just asked his expert what training or knowledge he has in regards to physical forces of vehicles in a collision sequence and anticipated damage. And this was his response.
Obviously, the higher the speed, the more damage. The lower speed, the less damage.
Lally asked Trooper Paul what he observed on the video. Is that consistent with the damage that he observed to Karen's car? So basically, based on that extensive training and knowledge that he just described to us, could he please provide his expert opinion of whether or not any of that damage could have come from her hitting John's car in the driveway?
It is not consistent with the taillight in this collision.
And why not?
For one thing, the collision, the taillight is, 42 to 50 inches off the ground. So that vehicle would have to have damage 42 to 50 inches off the ground, because they would have had to contact each other in the same distance from the ground, and there's no damage to that vehicle. So if the taillight breaks, it should leave some sort of scratching, maybe a dent, something on some sort of damage to that vehicle should have occurred.
So Trooper Paul says that there's no damage to John's car. So that means that Karen's car could not have had the damage caused from this impact. Now, look, I don't want to spend too much time playing all of the clips on this part because I want to save our time for the important parts. But I want to make a note that while he's talking about his supposed expert opinion, he is not clear or confident about anything. For example, Lally asks him what kind of damage he would expect to see on John's car if that impact is what had caused Karen's taillight to break. And his answer is maybe a cracked taillight or something like that, but it wouldn't, the damage is different, et cetera, et cetera. He also brings up the bumper and says that the scratch on her bumper could be consistent with hitting his car because it's around the same height and he has a ridge on his bumper, but he says that they have different types and colors of paint, so it might have shown up on her bumper. Basically, everything is answered in probablys, maybes, and could haves. And it doesn't come across as an expert opinion at all. When Jackson gets up to do his questioning, he's fuming mad to the point where he tells the judge that he's going to take a breath. Trooper Paul wants to tell the jury that the damage to Karen's car could not have come from hitting John's car in the driveway. And the whole point of this voir dire is for Alan Jackson to show the judge why he should not be allowed to testify to that. And Jackson's mad that Lally is trying to sneak this in, especially knowing that Trooper Paul is not qualified to give this opinion. And things get tense. But after he takes his breath and he calms down, then he goes through a long list of all the testing that Trooper Paul did not do. Never put the two cars together, never tested to see if the taillight could have come into contact with the car, never measured the car against any area on John's car, never did force multiplier tests or testing on the pressure needed to crack the plastic taillight. No testing if the taillight hit the metal part of the car, if it would leave any marks or damage. No experience with low-speed crash investigations like this, etc., etc. Trooper Paul says the first time that he saw the video in the driveway was on court TV about a year ago. He never put anything about this video or his opinion on it in his report, but when he met with Lally a couple of weeks before this, he said that he and Lally discussed it, and he told Lally that he could give his opinion at trial if he's asked on this. Now, Lally never asked him to make any kind of report about it, so this was a discovery violation and was not allowed in. When the jury returned the following day, Lally tried to work around that by asking questions in general terms. For example, in general terms, what would you expect to see in a car-to-car collision, like transfer of paint or scratches, etc.? And in general terms, with the heights of cars and so on. The damage to the car that he noted in his inspection will be discussed again in a little bit more detail as we work our way through the reconstruction testimony, so I'm not going to spend too much time going in depth on that yet. Now, while at the Sallyport doing the inspection, Trooper Paul was also asked to do some testing on Karen Reed's SUV to make note of what, if any, issues there may be mechanically or with any of the cameras or sensors, etc. Trooper Paul said that he analyzed the steering wheel and the brake pedals while he was sitting in the garage, and then he did some testing with it in the driveway next to Canton PD. He did forward braking test, reverse braking test, reverse acceleration tests, and he used a V-Box, which measures the performance for the vehicle using GPS data to measure the speed and location so that they know how fast they're stopping and things like that. He conducted 2 tests on acceleration and reverse acceleration. He set the parameters up to 25 miles per hour and tried to come from a stop at 0 miles per hour and then accelerate to see how fast he could get to 25 miles per hour. He also checked cameras and things like that, but here's something that I thought was interesting. He did this during the day because he said that he didn't care about replicating the scenario or how night vision would have been different because he said that she hit him on purpose. So there was no point in that. I think that's interesting. Trooper Paul says on the stand that even if the camera systems were covered in snow, and even if the systems were defective, and even if the mirrors were blocked and everything was wrong, any attentive and reasonable operator would not travel in reverse, especially at a high rate of speed. They would have cleaned off the mirrors and they would have made the camera systems, made sure they worked, and they would have done all of this prior to accelerating in reverse. Look, he goes on and on about this, and obviously this calls for speculation. So there's finally an objection, it's sustained, and this is struck from the record. Based on his inspection of Karen Reed's SUV, Trooper Paul determined that everything on the car was working fine. There were no outside factors with the car that would have caused this to be some kind of accident, and the damage on the car was not caused by hitting John O'Keefe's car in the driveway, although he didn't get to tell the jury that. So inspection and testing are done. Now it's time to move on to job number 2, downloading and imaging the ACM. So the ACM, the airbag control module, this is what controls the airbags and the seatbelt pretensioners. The ACM has what's called an EDR, or Event Data Recorder, and it does exactly what the name suggests. It records data of events. Now, the events are basically anything that happened in the car that would cause a change in velocity, like if you run into another car, for example. That's going to be enough force to cause a change to the velocity of the car, and it would then trigger the EDR, which will record data happening at that time. Anything like speeds, directions, braking, etc. Now, Trooper Paul was asked to download the information from the car, so he created a digital image of it, the same way that you would do when you're creating a digital image of a cell phone. So it's just a way to access the data so that they can potentially get more information about what's going on. Now, there was no information recorded on the EDR from Karen's car, which means there was not a significant change in her velocity that would cause it to record anything. This isn't surprising, and this is something that both Trooper Paul and Dr. Wolf explained in their testimonies. It's common for pedestrian strikes not to set off the EDR because they don't create enough of a change in velocity, since the weight difference between a big SUV and a pedestrian is such a big difference. So the EDR is out. It tells us nothing. So on to job number 3, mapping out the scene. Trooper Paul leaves the Sallyport and heads over to 34 Fairview with Lieutenant Gallagher from Canton Police Department, a trainee that he was apparently training, a diagram from the CERT team, and what he referred to as the lowdown from the other officers about what they said happened. The diagrams from the CERT team show the location of where John O'Keefe was found, and also the shoe, the plastic pieces, and the glass cup. He was told that this is a pedestrian collision, so he was asked to come up with the explanation on how it happened. So Trooper Paul walks through how he did this, and he says that he used mapping tools and a GPS and a drone, among other things. He used this to plot out where he believed the shoe, the cup, and the plastic were recovered based on the CERT team diagram. Then he created his own diagram from that and listed them on there and plotted out the area where Gallagher told him that John O'Keefe was found, and then the distance between where John was found and each piece of evidence. Now, according to his diagram, he says that the shoe was approximately 9 feet away from John O'Keefe's body to the southeast. The cup pieces were 1 foot away from him to the north. The red plastic taillight pieces were 7 feet away to the east. The clear plastic taillight pieces were 10 foot away to the southeast. And another red plastic piece was 12 foot away to the southeast. Now, with all that mapped out, it's time now he tries to determine the point of impact. He was told that Karen hit John while going in reverse, and there was a statement that she made, according to Proctor, that she did a 3-point turn when she was leaving. So, in order to determine where the point of impact was, or at least the area of it, Trooper Paul said that he followed the path of debris. He said that there were items found in the roadway, and John was found wherever Gallagher pointed. So he followed the path of travel in a linear direction based on that, and then determined what he believed to be the area where the collision occurred during this 3-point turn, and then developed his theory. So that's it, right? All 3 jobs he was hired to do. Done. But not quite. So I told y'all that this part gets messy, and we are now officially arriving at the mess. Let's talk about key cycles. On February 1st and 2nd of 2022, when Trooper Paul was doing all of this testing and inspecting and mapping, he wasn't able to get access to any data from the EDR. But fast forward to February of 2023, and in comes Toyota TechStream data. Now, Lexus is owned by Toyota, and this is their software that kind of does the same thing. It records vehicle control history to monitor driving behaviors and the data related to different triggers. So, for example, if you hit the brakes really hard, it will record a list of things like whether you're in reverse or drive, and the degree and direction of your steering wheel, and the speed that you're going, among other things. At the time of the initial testing of Karen's car, Trooper Paul didn't know anything about Toyota TechStream, so it was not downloaded at that time. Almost exactly 1 year later, they downloaded it because he said he quote, kind of learned about it. He said they downloaded it and he analyzed it to see if they could figure out what was relevant. Now, I want to pause for a minute and put some context on this because this TechStream info is going to get really messy. Pretty much the entire theory that Trooper Paul has developed is based on this TechStream data that he had no idea how to work. But like I said, he did say that he, quote, kind of learned, end quote, about it. And he said that he found that this information is relevant. Now, in contrast to that, Dr. Wolf actually has published peer-reviewed articles on the TechStream data and specifically on triggers and braking systems, which is exactly the information that's being used here. Unfortunately, since he was part of the federal investigation, his testimony is limited because the attorneys are unable to go through any of this with him in order to get his input. And that's a shame because, as you'll see, we are relying on expert testimony from someone who just learned that it even existed. But now we have this whole new set of data that gives you a ton of information about how the car is being operated at the time that something triggers it to start recording. The downside to this is that there is no GPS or location data attached to it, and there's also no dates or times. So how do you tell what's what? Every line on the report is identified by a key cycle number. For example, remember all the testing that Trooper Paul did on Karen's car? The testing of the acceleration and the brakes and things like that, of course, that kind of testing is going to cause some triggers, which will make the system start recording things for about 5 seconds before the triggering event occurred and 5 seconds after. So when he's out there in Canton Police Department parking lot testing this car and slams on the brakes, the TechStream report will show all kinds of information for what was happening in the car 5 seconds before and 5 seconds after each time he does something like that. But it won't tell you when, where, or what time it happened. It's all organized by these key cycles. So all of those tests that he was doing made something trigger in the system. There were actually 22 separate triggers that were recorded during that testing, and all of them had the same key cycle number. First, let's talk about what a key cycle is. Think about getting in your car and you want to turn on your radio without actually cranking the car. So you turn your key from the off position to that middle position, the one that turns on your accessories and wakes up your battery without starting the motor. Getting to that position where the battery comes on is the start of a key cycle. And when it's turned back off and the battery goes back down, that is the end of that key cycle. A key cycle is different than an ignition cycle. And Trooper Paul and Alan Jackson go back and forth about this for a while he's on the stand. And I want to explain the difference. An ignition cycle is when the motor also comes on along with the battery. Now, obviously, you cannot have an ignition cycle without a key cycle. And these are two different counters and two different numbers. Each time there's a successful key turn that boots up the battery, whether you go on ahead and crank the car or not, as long as you are booting up the battery, it begins a key cycle. That is then labeled numerically in order. Every single time that the battery comes on, a new number is assigned in order. Trooper Paul said that according to his report, when he did the inspection of Karen Reed's car the previous year, her odometer was at 12,665 miles. He checked the odometer now and it's 1 mile higher, and there's a list of 22 triggers that were recorded from the time the odometer went from 12,665 to 12,666, and all 22 of those triggers were on the same key cycle, number 1164. This lets him know that that was definitely the time that he was doing the testing. Now, this data list only prints out triggers, so if you have a key cycle where there's no triggers, then that key cycle will not show up on the report. Trooper Paul says mile 12,629 had 2 triggers recorded. We'll call them A and B. The key cycle associated with this is 1162. The mileage difference on the odometer from that key cycle to now is 36 miles. So Trooper Paul talks to Trooper Proctor, who tells him the places where he knows Karen Reed to have traveled. Trooper Paul then plugs in to Google to get the mileage of those suggested routes. He calculated from Fairview to John O'Keefe's, and then to Waterfall, and then to Jen McCabe's, and then back to John O'Keefe's, and then to Karen Reed's parents' house. He said that the range of miles based on Google suggested routes was between 36.1 miles and 38.8 miles. So, based on that, he concluded that these 2 triggering events were associated with Karen Reed striking John O'Keefe. He describes Cycle A, the first triggering event, as Karen Reed slowing down and making a U-turn. Now, the car is traveling at almost 10 miles an hour, and it slows down and then it stops, and then it starts accelerating again, gets to 6.2 miles per hour, and then stops, and then it goes back up gradually from 1.7 miles per hour to 8.7 miles per hour. So this trigger is from there being higher acceleration immediately after putting the car in reverse. So, and Trooper Paul said that this is a U-turn, but of course this sounds more like a 3-point turn, and Jackson tries to have him clarify.
Triggering event is what? Was it a 3-point turn or a U-turn? I thought I heard you say both.
I guess it would be more, 3-point turns, essentially, I guess it's a 3-point turn.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, did you say U-turn on Friday? Because I could have sworn I heard that.
It could have been a U-turn. I mean, it's still turning around, so you had to make a U-turn when that's a 3-point turn or not, but it's still.
Okay, but not to be picky, but sort of my job.
Okay.
A U-turn is traveling in one direction, turning, right? Turning the wheel, never changing gear, once it's reverse or anything, just turn it, right? A 3-point turn requires moving forward, stopping, changing gears, moving backward, stopping, changing gears, using a steering input, and then moving off, correct?
Correct.
Well, those are 2 very different maneuvers, right? You'd agree?
It's, in a sense, I was trying to say she made a U-turn. Like, you can say when they made a U-turn, it's a 3-point turn, they're still making a U-turn, and I didn't mean it as like she literally had to make a direct U-turn. She was turning around, and obviously the diagram, or the trigger shows a 3-point turn.
We've talked before about Karen Reed and John O'Keefe getting lost when they were on the way to Fairview Road. The cell phone report says that she reversed directions, but of course it didn't specify if it was a 3-point turn or a U-turn. But the U-turn that they're talking about in Cycle A could be from where they missed Fairview Road and had to reverse directions and go back. So let's move on to Cycle B, the second triggering event. Cycle B happens 19 minutes after the key cycle started, and about 8 minutes after the 3-point turn. So let's just assume that the 3-point turn from Cycle A is the reversing direction from where they missed Fairview Road and had to turn around. That happened at 12:24, according to the cell phone data. Unfortunately, none of these key cycles have any kind of time or date or location on them. So all we can do is try to line them up with other factors that we know. So if we line this up with the cell phone data, and this U-turn is the same as the one at 12:24, the second triggering event is 8 minutes later, which would be 12:32. Trooper Paul says that this appears to be consistent with a pedestrian strike because there's a sudden change of speed that 24.2 goes to 23.6 miles per hour in a half a second. He says this happens while the accelerator pedal is still extended at 74%. The steering wheel angle goes from left at 4.5 degrees and then goes right 4.5 degrees and then goes back left after that. So he says that that is something that's consistent with a pedestrian strike. One thing I noticed is that Trooper Paul said the accelerator pedal percentage remained extended 74% while the speed dropped. And it's true that the accelerator pedal was at 74% when the speed dropped, but it was at 74.5% before that. So both the accelerator pedal and the speed dropped by 0.5 at the time that the steering wheel shifted. So he says that this is consistent with a pedestrian strike. So what supports his theory? The timing of the 3-point turn and then 8 minutes later are the last steps on John's phone. So that could line up. The problem with that, of course, is that if she connected to John's Wi-Fi 4 minutes later, that would be really hard because it's an estimated 7-minute trip in good conditions, and it would be hard for her to get there and get inside close enough to be able to connect in roughly half that time. You would think that she would have to at least be in the garage. The odometer readings can support this, though, based on Trooper Paul's Google Maps estimates. So some of that lines up. The timeline would be difficult, but there's also another big problem. Let's go back and talk about those key cycles. Remember that a key cycle is every time that the key is put in the ignition and the accessories or the battery turns on. So every time it's cranked and started, that would automatically have a key cycle associated to it. So here's the big problem. Trooper Paul's testing key cycle was 1164. 1162 is the one that Trooper Paul says has these two triggering events that he says are connected to John O'Keefe's death. But think about the videos that we've seen up to this point in the trial. Let's kind of go back. If you have Trooper Paul's testing cycle as 1164, we know that the last time that it was seen before that on the video is when it's being pulled into the Sally port. So that would be 1163. The time right before that we saw it last is when the police took Karen's car at her parents' house. There's a video that we can see from her parents' ring footage, and we see them reversing the car and then pulling up onto the tow truck. But it doesn't just go reverse and then directly onto the tow truck. You can tell that it looks like it's maybe stuck in the snow. There's a lot of snow that's fallen at that point. So you can see them move it forward and then back and then forward and back a few times. Then even when they get it finally out of the snow and are able to line it up to get it on the truck, they have to pull it forward and back a few more times. So it was kind of a process. But that was key cycle 1162. 1161 would have been from John O'Keefe's house to Karen Reed's parents' house. We saw this ring video where she's in the driveway and her dad is there and her brother's there. She had gone inside to get some of her stuff and talk to the kids, and then she left with her parents and her brother. That would have been 1161. We know that there was a key cycle before that, 1160, where Karen Reed is seen pulling out of the driveway, and she's pulling out of the garage and she hits John's car, and then she's pulling out of the driveway and she goes to Jen McCabe's house. That would have been 1160. So 1159 would have been the key cycle in question, where she is leaving Waterfall, goes to Fairview, and then goes to John's house. 1159, not 1162. I want to play this clip of Alan Jackson asking Trooper Paul about this. Now remember, Trooper Paul is really new at this whole tech stream data, so this is him trying to explain it.
Right, you know exactly where the car is, who's in the car, who turned the car on, and what the triggering events were and what they reflected, because you did it, correct?
Correct.
It's you.
Yes.
So that would be the cornerstone, basically, of your entire analysis of the key cycles.
Say again?
The cornerstone. In other words, the one known that is immovable, it's immutable, is 1164 began your testing. Is that right?
Objection.
Is that right? I'm going to allow the question.
Yeah, that's when the car was in state custody.
All right. So starting at 1164 and counting backward, before you started your testing, you know that the SUV had to be started, the ignition had to be turned over, and it was driven to the Sally Port in Canton at 5:31 p.m. from a tow truck on January 29th, correct?
I didn't know that.
You did or did not?
Did not know that.
Okay. Assuming that the car had to be started and put on a tow truck, that would be key cycle what?
I don't know how. I can't speak to the fact that recorded a key cycle at that time.
I can't hear you.
I can't speak to the fact that we would record a key cycle at that time.
Okay. If the car was turned on and driven onto a tow truck, would that be a key cycle?
I don't know because these keys record different ways, so I can't speak to how or why it did not record on there. All I can speak to is that those are the key cycles. The odometer mileage is more what I was going after on this whole thing.
Trooper Paul, you just said unequivocally, when a car is turned on and then turned off, there's a key cycle.
I said when the car without the ignition on, that's a key cycle.
Right.
That's correct.
That's what I mean, when it's turned on, when the engine turns on.
That's the definition of what it is. I can't speak to why it didn't go on, why it did not record.
So all Trooper Paul can say is he doesn't know why those key cycles didn't record. Now, he and Alan Jackson go back and forth, and he keeps kind of muddying the waters. Jackson just wants to clarify. He wants to walk backwards on this, the way that I just did. He wants to say, we have video. There had to be a key cycle at this time because we have video of somebody in the car driving it. That would have to be a key cycle. And he kind of goes back and forth about the terminology, about the ignition cycles. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter. The ignition cycles don't matter. An ignition cycle is automatically going to be a key cycle. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. But they make it that complicated. I'll be honest, y'all. I am getting really tired of hearing that the data is wrong and they can't tell us why. It makes no sense that a system that is so complex and exact, designed to be so intricately coded that it records the percentages of how far in your gas pedal is pushing and how many degrees to the left or right that your steering wheel is turning, and all of the changes in all of these half-second increments. It makes no sense that a system like that would somehow just accidentally not count multiple times when a car is turned on. This isn't like GPS that's relying on satellite or good reception. This isn't like pedometers that are relying on movement to recognize patterns. This is a car turning on multiple times. Those key cycles can't just disappear, right? Trooper Paul didn't have an explanation. All he could say was he doesn't know, but they didn't record. That answer is not good enough anymore. Y'all, I spent days researching this. I have called everybody that I can think to call. I've talked to forensic crash reconstructionist engineers, and I've talked to Lexus specialists, and I've talked to Toyota specialists, and I even joined a group online that is for certified Lexus specialists and was asking them. I had to pay $40 a month for that membership. I was able to get in touch with a forensic engineering consultant who has been actually working with this software for more than a decade. I'm trying to get those questions answered. If a woman's life is on the line, the answer should be more than, I don't know. I hope to have some answers by next week. In the meantime, I keep trying to make it work. I keep going over different scenarios and seeing different problems with both sides. Again, that's a common theme in this trial. There's another issue that the data points record every half second. And the reason that's an issue is if you map out exactly where Karen's car was at each half second interval, it wouldn't be possible for her to have gone in reverse as far as the data says that she did if we are to believe that Brian Higgins was actually parked in front of the mailbox like he said. He says that, the McCabe's both said that, Nicole Albert said that, but it's worth noting, Ricky D'Antano and Ryan Nagel and Heather Maxson said that he wasn't. Who knows at this point? The timeline would still be a major problem. If the last contact for that trigger was at 12:32 and she connected to the Wi-Fi 4 minutes later on a 7-minute drive, she would have had to been flying home. And if you look at the report, none of those things triggered on the way home. If you look at the report where they were testing Karen's car, you can see some of the other things that will set off those triggers. And they were set off in the parking lot, sudden braking history, accelerating the pedal at an opening angle that's high right after releasing the brake. If you're hurrying home, that would be something you would do, right? Accelerator pedal opening signal is high during low speed, so that means you're trying to get away fast. Accelerating right after shifting it into a forward position. How could she have made it home in almost half the time without triggering anything else? So, what else could explain that? If those two triggering events weren't related to John O'Keefe's death and they weren't in front of Fairview, if we count backwards, that would mean that those two triggering events happened while Karen Reed's car was in custody of the state police. So the key cycles that we know of, the ones that I just counted back, those are just the ones that we have the video surveillance of, so we know that those exist. If we look at just those, then like I said, this one would be at her parents' house when the driver is putting her car on the tow truck. So could these cycles, A and B, could those line up for this tow truck situation? Well, let's look at it. One of the issues on the triggering points was a 3-point turn. Now, if you look at the video in front of Karen Reed's parents' house, the car is consistent with doing a 3-point turn as far as the stopping and going forward and the stopping and going forward. The wheels do look like they kind of get stuck in the snow at one point. You can see where they pull up and then they pull back. So if the wheels are spinning, that could count for some of that. Sure. The odometer reading is the same on cycle A as it is on cycle B. So that could definitely line up. One of the triggers happens 19 minutes after the start, and they are 8 minutes apart from each other. So that's something that we can't really verify because we only see the video from where they're already in the car and moving it. We don't see the video before that, so we don't know how long the car was on or how long they were in it or how long they were trying to move it. And we see them pull it onto the truck and then pull it back off and then pull it back on and then it stops. So since we don't have the full video or we don't have any knowledge about how long they were in it or what happened before or after, that's one thing that we can't really line up on this. So once again, we have conflicting data. How does that happen? How does that happen in every part of this case? Unfortunately, right now, there's no way for us to know for sure if those triggers were recorded outside of Fairview Road or if they were by the tow truck. And if they were in front of Fairview Road, there's also no way to tell that she hit John either. I mean, the acceleration barely slowed, and if she's reversing that fast, it could potentially be hitting a curb or spinning on the slick streets since the snow had just started, and then slowing and steering wheel jerking when the tires grip. These are all questions that I still have, and I don't know why they can't be answered. Hopefully, I'll be able to have some more insight next week. I promised y'all a bonus episode this week, but I didn't realize that it was going to be this long. So I'll have to split it into 2 parts. I'll release the second half next week, and I'm going to have Dr. Kenneth Kinsey join me on Tuesday to give his expert opinion on the injuries and the Reconstructionists from both sides. I can't wait to hear what he has to say about this. So I'll add some clips in from that as well as a bonus. Thanks for listening. I'll see y'all next week. My name is Brandy Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast. If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your friends. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.